Very pleased today to be hosting the presentation you are about to see from EPRI, what I'm sure many of you know is the Electric Power Research Institute, which for more than 35 years has brought scientists and engineers together to try to meet some of the major challenges that the electric utility industry and indeed this critical sector of our economy have faced. And they've made many contributions, many of them technological as well as market and policy issues as well. I must say we're very pleased here at RFF that we actually have a chair in honor of Chauncey Starr, the chair, Chauncey Starr Chair in Risk Analysis. Chauncey was both the founder and longtime leader of EPRI, and indeed he was a pioneer in the field of risk analysis, and we're doing some important work that you may have seen in our most recent version of Resources Magazine, which his chair has helped make possible. But also, I had the pleasure of serving for several years on the board of directors of the Electric Power Research Institute, so even though I'd known the organization for many years, my respect and admiration for the talents that it brings to bear on these critical questions only was magnified by that experience, and to watch the leadership of Steve Specker and a very skilled management team, a portion of which you'll hear from today, I found very impressive. Today they're going to provide a presentation, as I think you know from the invitation, on what they call their PRISM analysis and their merge analysis. It's an update of something they've been doing for several years. I'd like to call to your attention this report just came out. I think August was the first presentation at the summer seminar, which a number of us attended. But also at literally a week before, the National Academy of Sciences came out with the final version of their America's Independent Energy Future, which is a major comprehensive study on energy policy, as you may know, and both of these deserve to get careful attention to the detail, but I'm going to give you a massive and rapid summary of some ways that I found these things are remarkably similar in some of their conclusions, and I hope both parties will forgive me for overstating and oversimplifying. But I think the significant for the public policy debate underway today these are the conclusions I drew from them. One is that it is quite feasible technically and technologically for us to meet the kind of climate goals that are being discussed in the Congress and on the international scene, meaning an 80% reduction by the United States by 2050 and a 50% reduction, by the way, around the world. The other is that both really come to the conclusion that for us to hope to reach that, we are smart to engage in a portfolio of technologies and portfolios of fuel sources and be very careful not to get sucked into the notion that one or two slices of the pie we can count on enough that we should put all our chips in those baskets or those slices. And indeed, the portfolio effect is viewed as important. That approach, or multiple approaches, is viewed as critically important because of our uncertainty to know just what can really develop on the scale that we need in the country, and secondly, to try to keep the cost as reasonable as we possibly can on that path, which both agree is not without cost. Among, of course, those broad strategies are the obvious ones. There's a greater potential for efficiency gains throughout the system, both within the utility system as well as the end use. There is important role to be played by renewable sources of energy as a fuel source. But it's also what both of them came to a conclusion that is not as well received politically by some political groups in the country at the moment, that among the technological approaches that need to be demonstrated, indeed the Academy says it's urgent to demonstrate in the next decade, is that we demonstrate the technology of CCS to see whether it's really going to be available to us. That's carbon capture and storage is really going to be available to us in decades ahead on a scale that will help us with fossil fuels. And the second was that we really need to, in this next decade, to demonstrate that we can actually build at least a handful of nuclear power plants, which is a new technology. It's not the technology there was worried about demonstrating, is just the capacity to actually construct on budget, on time, in a way that makes that a reasonable a choice of option in the decades beyond that. Well, I don't want to overstress this, and it's not my role to take up the time here, but I think both of these studies are things that deserve some attention. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Howard. He's been a well-respected leader in many of these issues and within the electric utility industry, and he is now Senior Vice President of Research and Development at EPRI, and he is going to provide the analysis and give you an opportunity to ask questions and comment on the work that they have been doing. Michael?
Hey. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. And good afternoon. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here this afternoon. I've looked forward to this since I found out we were invited a few weeks ago, and it's again a very, very just a big honor to be here. And thank you. It's a great turnout. So what I'd like to do is this afternoon is to share with you some of the results, the analysis that we've been working on. This is the third year now, and looking at this, what's the technical issues around achieving a decarbonized electric sector. What are the cost issues? What are the economic issues? What are the technical issues? This is the third year that we've done this analysis, and we introduced it at our summer seminar about a month ago, and so I'm here to share with you some of the conclusions and maybe try to go into a little bit more detail than we have in the past. So just got to sit back and enjoy. If there's questions, raise your hand. We'll tackle any question that you have and look forward to it. So let's go ahead and get started. But before I do so, how many of you are familiar with EPRI? Just kind of show a hand that, okay, excellent. Well, I'll quickly cover the next slide then, because this is a little bit about EPRI. We were started, as Phil said, by the electric utility industry. Chauncey Starr was our first president. Our focus, though, is to work on and help advance research, development, deployment, and ultimately the commercialization of solutions to many of the difficult technical challenges that we face in the electric utility industry. And we do that by working collaboratively with our industry partners. And it's not just in the U.S., but also worldwide. We span the entire spectrum of the electric utility industry, from generation to transmission, delivery, distribution, and also the more efficient utilization of electricity. So we span the entire spectrum of the electricity industry. So that's a little bit about EPRI. But now what about the presentation? There are some specific key issues that I want to get, and insights that I want to get across today, and I'll work through that in the next few minutes as we go through this presentation. But the first one is an understanding of the technical challenges that we face in this industry to not only decarbonize, but also to do it in a way that's affordable, reliable, environmentally responsible. That's a big challenge, to do all of that. And we're going to talk about what some of those challenges are, some of the issues around that. This is, you're going to see this slide a couple of times during this presentation, and I'd like to go ahead and kind of frame it for you so you can get acclimated to it. The vertical axis is the wholesale electricity cost in terms of $2,007 or cents per kilowatt hour. And then the horizontal is the emission intensity, decarbonization, in terms of metric tons of CO2 per megawatt hour. And the red dot is where we are today. So we're roughly about 62, 63 metric tons of CO2 per megawatt hour in the U.S., system-wide. And we're a little bit north of 6 cents per kilowatt hour of electricity in terms of 2007. That's kind of where we're at. Now the question is, where do we want to go? Where do we want to be? What's their objective? Obviously, we want to move to the right. We want to decarbonize, and we want to do it in a way that it's affordable. And so what I'm going to do is talk about the challenges of moving that red dot to the right. That's the focus. And we're going to look at the technical challenges, the technical issues, and the economic issues associated with getting there. But to get started, what we're also going to do is discuss what does it take to meet that challenge. How do we get there? It's important to recognize that the decisions that we make today, you and I, policymakers, technologists, make today, will set the course of what we look like in 2050. And you just look back 40 years ago. I mean, that's only 40 years away. You look back at where we were 40 years ago and how that influenced where we are today. And certainly in this electric sector, that's the case when we look out 40 years from now. So as I go through this, think about the decisions that it takes today to get there will influence and highly determine where we're going to be in 40 years, 2050. What's the CO2 challenge? This slide shows the electric sector and the U.S. economy wide CO2 emissions. The electric sector, about a third total emissions in the economy. Historical, this is billion tons of CO2, and time. Now, if we project out, and we look at in fact, the red dots there represents the milestones outlined in the Waxman-Markey bill. It provides us a guideline in terms of the profile of the emission reduction between now and 2050. So if we go out in 2050, that black line says that we will reduce our emissions by 83% by 2050. So that's the profile. And I'll talk about that in just a second as we look at the economic model and the importance of that. If we look at the cost, you look back over the last 40 years, the real rate of electricity has been pretty flat over the last 40 years. But what will it be 40 years from now? Well, we're going to talk about that. Let's first discuss the technical challenges associated with accomplishing those objectives that I laid out. Decarbonization in the electric sector, and two, doing it that's affordable. For the last 3 years, we've looked at what are the issues, the technical challenges associated with reducing the emission profile in the electricity sector. We've done a bottoms-up study. We use the research that we do at EPRI across the entire spectrum. We take a look at that, and we say, what are the technical challenges to achieve the objectives that I just mentioned? What are they? And we base it on, we start with the EIA base case. And this shows that the EIA base case, the vertical axis is the CO2 emissions in the electricity sector. The vertical axis is time. The horizontal axis is time. This is the historical emissions in the electricity sector. And then the EIA projects out to 2030 what they estimate the emissions will be under their reference case or base case. 2007, you can see the top line, came back, redid in 2008, and now it's 2009. We're projecting, our study is based on, the 2009 study is based on the 2009 emissions profile between now and 2030. And so that's what I'm going to use as my reference case. What we've done, though, is we've looked at a set of technologies and said, based on each of these technologies, what is the emission reduction contribution if we were to move forward with that technology? We know these different technologies is technically feasible because we've done the research to understand what are the issues. And so it is technically feasible to reduce, using a set of technologies, to reduce the emissions profile between now and 2030 by 41% compared to 2005. It's technically feasible. Now, it's technically feasible, but there are a lot of things that we have to do to accomplish that. We have to quickly move forward with a lot of research and development, demonstration, and deployment of the technology between now and certainly over the next 10 years. And I'm going to mention a few of those here in a second. Let me take a look at the technologies that we're talking about. It's difficult, I'm sure, for those in the back to see the details, but I want to. It's not as important right now, the details of this, as you kind of feel the big picture. And we were, by the way, we have. Can you hold that up just a second? Yeah. Some of you see this journal, the EPRI journal. Some of you were able to get a copy. We ran out. We apologize. Inside that EPRI journal is a pamphlet, a handout that includes a lot of the details behind what I'm going to talk about. If you did not get a copy of that, because unfortunately we ran out, if you did not get a copy, go to EPRI.com. You can download your own copy and look at it. And if you have any questions about it, give us a call. We can walk you through it. So certainly don't forget to go there and take a look at the presentation, the EPRI journal, and more information about the assumptions and technology behind the EPRI Prism. All right, so what's in the EPRI Prism? As I said, it's a set of technologies that is used that's technically feasible to reduce the electricity CO2 emission between now and 2030. It starts off with energy efficiency. Certainly there's a lot we can do with energy efficiency. If we move forward with that, then you can see if I can show this to the blue slice right there. That's how much we can reduce by being more energy efficient. The other one, transmission and distribution efficiency. Right now, approximately 7 and 9% losses associated with transmission and distribution in the U.S. We can reduce that. We know how we can do that right now. And it's certainly technically feasible to reduce that by 20% losses in the transmission and distribution of electricity between now and 2030. And if we do that, you can see right there the slice there. The next one is renewables. The EIA base case says they estimate that there will be an additional 60 gigawatts of renewables on top of what we already have right now, approximately 37 gigawatts of renewables, an additional 60 gigawatts between now and 2030. We think it could be more than that. In fact, we think it could be somewhere close to about 135 gigawatts. And if we do that, you can see the contribution that those additional renewables make to reducing the CO2 emissions in the electricity sector. Nuclear. The EIA base case assumes that there will be 12.5 gigawatts of new build between now and 2030. Again, we think it could be more than that. No retirements between now and 2030. Assumption is that, in fact, we absolutely have to continue to run our nuclear fleet safely, reliably, and economically. And in addition to that, between now and 2020, we think that it's technically feasible to build 10 gigawatts of new nuclear, and after that, between then and 2030, 64 gigawatts. And then you can see the contribution that makes to reducing our CO2 footprint. You got a question?
Mike, you've used the word technically feasible many times. Can you better define that for us in terms of what you specifically
Okay. The question is, I've used the term technically feasible, and what does that mean? Good question. What we mean when we say technically feasible is that we don't see any significant technical barriers to the implementation of the technology. Although it does take moving forward to the research to optimize the solution and the cost, it takes to develop and specifically demonstrate the technology and deploy it so that it can be commercialized at scale at a reasonable cost. So we don't see any technical barrier. We've done enough research, we've done enough work to know no technical barrier, but we've got to get started now to make sure that we have that technology that is commercially deployable at a reasonable cost to the industry. Okay?
So you're allowing costs to go up a bit?
We're allowing costs to go up a bit. That was the question. Let me answer that here when we get to the next, when we talk about the economics. The question is, we're allowing the cost to go up a bit. the PRISM looks at just the technology, what's technically feasible if we were to get it all right from a technical perspective. The cost side, let me hold off and we'll get to that in just a second, okay? Next is fossil efficiency. There's work that we can do to improve the efficiency of our existing fossil fleet, and if we do that, then you can see the contribution that makes. And finally, the last one is carbon capture and storage. We have to move forward with carbon capture and storage. There's a lot of work we need to do. We're doing some demonstration pilot plants right now, and we're involved in those, and it's extremely important, and we're trying to move forward with the commercialization of that technology, along with a lot of our utility partners and vendors playing a major role in that work. And if we did that, that is the contribution that it would make. In fact, by 2020, we need to have this commercially deployable so that 90% capture for new coal and combined cycle, natural gas combined cycle, is commercially deployable after 2020 and retrofits, we think, to 60 gigawatts of existing plants. That's our objective. That's what we've laid out in our PRISM, and you can see the effect would reduce the CO2 emissions in the electric sector by 41% in 2030. Yes, sir.
Just what are the gigawatts for the new builds of CCS?
For all new builds after 2020, it would be 90% capture. And you're saying the question is, how much of what's the total? Do you know?
I don't know the total.
I don't. Yeah. Well,
Tens of gigawatts.
yeah, tens of gigawatts. You'll see it in a different perspective when we get to our economic model. So maybe we can get some clarity on that when we get there. Now, in addition, though, there's more that we can do. And there's a role that the electric sector can play in helping to decarbonize the entire economy. And two examples of that we've included in this analysis. One is electric transportation, the advancement of electric transportation, because by the time that electric transportation is rolled out, we're going to be having a set of generation options that are more decarbonized. In addition, electro technologies, so converting traditional fossil fuel for industrial heating, let's say, to electricity that has a smaller CO2 footprint. And when you combine those two together, you can see the additional contribution of that. And when we look at yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, just another basic question.
Sure.
The gigawatts equivalent for wind, what's the nameplate capacity for it?
What was it? I didn't say the name.
What are you assuming to transfer the gigawatts of wind to gigawatts equivalent?
The gigawatts of wind. Well, the capacity, the utilization factor, capacity factor right now is roughly 31%. In the economic model, you see we push that up to 40%. Is the capacity factor of wind that we assume you would eventually achieve 40% over time. So this is a generation mix under both of those models. One is the EIA reference case on the left, and on the right is the PRISM. It's based on the assumptions that we just talked about, the advancement of those technologies. And you can see it's two different worlds. In fact, with the PRISM, this side, you can see that about 60% of the generation mix is made up of no to low carbon electricity production. On the left, if you take a look at the left, well, it looks very similar to what we have today, right? I mean, we're roughly, 50% coal right now? It shows 19% nuclear. Well, okay, maybe we're closer to 20, but it's a very similar model to where we are now. This is the EIA base case. And what we are suggesting is technically feasible to decarbonize the industry by 2030. Okay. Now, what I just presented is, again, looking at bottoms-up technology that's associated with getting us to that end point in 2030. Now, there are a couple of questions, though, I'd like to ask. What if we limit what we do? What if we limit the set of generation technologies available to us? What if we said there's no new nuclear? What if we said there's no CCS available? What does that world look like in 2030, 2050? What does it look like? No new nuclear, no CCS. That's a constraint, okay? But what if I also say that one of the other constraints is that we have to meet the emissions profile that's laid out that I showed you on that dark line? What if I said we had to meet that by 2050? But again, no CCS, no nuclear. What does the world look like? Anybody want to speculate? A lot of gas. High prices, a lot of gas. What else? About renewables. A lot of renewables. Some renewables. Yeah. It's definitely a different world. Well, part of our purpose in doing this is to give you some insights of what the two bookends look like. What if we have a world of all of the technologies commercially available? What if we have a world that's kind of limited in what's available? So you can get kind of an intuitive feeling of, and then as you're standing around the water cooler and somebody asks, well, what about this, what about that? You can kind of frame the answer from the perspective of some of the things you've gained and insights you've gained today. And so what we've done is we've tried to define the boundary conditions or the bookends of these two worlds so you can get some more insight on what it looks like in 2050. And that's what I'm going to work through next. So we've looked at the technology. Now we're going to limit. In limiting the technology, we have to start taking a look at the economics. So now we're going to jump into the economics. But to do so, I'm just going to define two terms. A full portfolio, as I said, is a set of all the technologies we just mentioned. The limited portfolio, no CCS, no new nuclear. Now, to get a handle on this issue, probably 20 years ago at least, we started working with Stanford University to develop an economic model. Now, Rich Richels, how many of you heard that name? I know I mentioned a couple of people here earlier. They said, be sure to tell him hi. And we got dinner with Rich later tonight, so I'll be sure and do that. He and some other folks at EPRI and at Stanford developed this very robust optimization model. And it's got constraints, inputs, and gives you an output. But the bottom line is this economic model maximizes economic wealth. Or the flip side, minimize cost. But the focus is maximizing wealth. Now, we've included into this model a set of inputs and a set of constraints. Input is the cost projections for the different technologies. At EPRI, every year we go through a detailed analysis of looking at all the different generation options that are available to us. And we say, what are those costs projected to be? Based on learning curve, based on new technology, based on some R&D insights that we've gained in the previous year. And we estimate what those different costs are between now and 2020, 2030, and on to 2050. And we incorporate that into the model. We look at the amount of resources that are available, uranium, fuel sources, oil, natural gas, and so on. We include that as well. And we include a constraint in this particular model that we have to meet the emissions profile as laid out on that chart a while ago. So that's the model. Everybody understand where we're going here and the constraints and so on, and how we arrived at this model and what we're doing. And then we let the model run. It brings in different mixes of generation technologies. But again, it's bringing those mixes in to, at the same time, make sure we meet that emission profile constraint. So let's see where we go. And the output is, you'll see it here in a second, includes the cost of electricity and on and on. So this is what it looks like. Just to kind of frame us, this is trillion kilowatt hours per year production on this axis. On the bottom is time, 2000 and 2050. And then this is the limited portfolio, the full portfolio. I see this because I'm going to be working with these charts here for the next couple of minutes. Yeah.
Lower the lights in front. You can see it a lot better.
Can you do that? Lower the lights a little bit in the front.
We're trying to do that. Your camera's
Oh, the camera. Okay. All right. Well, maybe I'll verbally paint the picture. Okay. This will, you'll be able to, I've actually had, you'll see this here in just a second. Let's look at the top line. See the top line? The top line represents the production under no constraints. So it's the production of electricity, consumption, if there were no constraints. Although, given the constraints that I just mentioned, like capping CO2 and emission profile and so on, then in the limited portfolio, all that we can produce, here's what we said we would like to have, here is what we said we would produce. The next line. See that? It's kind of flat, and you can see the one in the limited and the full portfolio. And the difference is demand reduction. Now, in the demand reduction, some of that is improvement in energy efficiency, make up the difference. Some of it is just demand destruction. Because remember, in the constraint in the model, this is all we can produce, even though we'd like to have that. We produce that, but we'd like to have that, and the difference is demand reduction. One of the insights from this study is that there's a 52% increase in demand reduction between the limited portfolio and the full portfolio. Either way, energy efficiency is extremely important. This is what the economic model says. Energy efficiency is extremely important. Yes, ma'am.
Will you be talking about I guess how that breaks down into demand destruction versus efficiency?
Yeah. One of the questions is, can we talk about how this breaks down between demand destruction and energy efficiency? And we've tried to look at the model, and it's hard to pull that information out. We know that it's going to have to be made up of one of the other, right? Either energy efficiency or demand destruction. But we're not sure exactly what percent it is. Although I can say under either scenario, it is a lot. I mean, that's if you look at in 2050, that's what 2 trillion kilowatt hours per year in the limited portfolio. So it is a lot of one or the other, energy efficiency or demand destruction. That's the one insight that we gleaned from this. So let's look at the set of technologies, generation technologies, that makes up this generation mix in both limited and full. And that's what I'd like to walk through next. This is what it looks like. It's two different worlds, limited and full. And you can see here the mix of generation technologies in the limited portfolio versus the full. So let's talk about some of the insights from each of these. First is renewables. You look here, you'll see that the amount of renewables in 2030 under either portfolio is a little bit north of 20% in 2030. But in the limited portfolio, as we go out to 2050, it jumps to 50%. Again, remember what we're doing? We're trying to meet that emission constraint. Now, at EPRI, we love all technologies. We're not trying to promote one or the other. It's just the way the economics works out. We want to advance the technology and ultimately the commercialization of all technologies, from solar to wind to nuclear to carbon capture and storage to gas and coal. So we're for all of them. But in this model, when you limit the amount of technology that's available to you, it's the way the economics works out. So that's what we find on renewables. Yeah, there's...
Do you understand why with the limited portfolio you have what looks to be slightly less wind than you have in the full, and also solar seems to become more economical with your limited?
Yeah. So the question is on this, wind seems like a little less, solar it's in one but not the other. Okay. I'm gonna hold off on answering that question until we get through some of the slides because you'll be able to see that, but I'll make sure to cover that in just a second, okay? Question in the back?
Yeah, just a point of clarification here. 20% and 50% is after your
It is energy. Yes.
One question, you show biofuels as helping you reduce the amount of CO2. Are you including the amount emitted from processing the biofuels, or are you including the amount from combustion of biofuels?
This includes the amount of combustion emissions, not the front end. That's right, just the amount of combustion that's emitted associated with that technology. Right. Let's take a look at nuclear and CCS. And I'll get back to answering these questions here in just a second. So in nuclear, you can see we're going to limit the amount of nuclear in the limited portfolio. On the full portfolio, we do have new nuclear that comes into the mix. And you can see in CCS, again, on CCS, there's no CCS available in the limited. So we pretty much run out of coal by 2030. Because you have to make sure you get the requirements in meeting the CO2 emission constraints. And in the full portfolio, we have CCS that comes into the mix, both retrofitted existing coal plants and new plants, retrofitting coming in around the 2010, 2020, and then on from there. And certainly commercially available by 2020 for new plants. So this is the full portfolio. Now, what about gas? Look at gas. Gas expands. You see here, around the 2010 to 2020 time frame, gas starts expanding. Why? Because you're sitting there saying, I'm really uncertain about the existence of nuclear and CCS. So what do? You fill the gap in with gas. And in fact, gas increases in the limited portfolio by 275%. Now look at what happens to gas. What happens in 2040? This is one of the key insights that we got just when we were kind of working through this. And it's that intuitive sense that I want to convey to you today also. What happens? Look at gas. It expands, but why does it contract in 2040? What happens? I got an idea? Cost? What else? All of a sudden you're moving forward a lot of gas and boom. Something happens in 2040. Why? CO2 constraints. All of a sudden, you can't get there with gas because you're ratcheting down your CO2 emissions. And then you wake up one morning and say, I can't get there even with gas. And what do? What's the other option? You're sitting here, you're moving along, you're in a limited portfolio, you get there at 2030, everything is working out pretty good, and all of a sudden you realize, I can't get there with gas. What do? What's the other option? Well, in the limited, you can't even expand to nuclear, right? By 2040, it's too late anyway. Solar, wind, your renewables. So that's why in the limited portfolio, all of a sudden, you can't get there with gas, so you let renewables expand. And that's what you see. That's why in 2050, you're over 50% renewables in the limited portfolio. So, these are some of the issues that you've got to, discuss and weigh against each other when we're trying to design what the world looks like in 2050. That's one of the insights. And here is the generation mix between the two. You can see in the limited portfolio in 2030, 50% gas. In the full portfolio, you have a much more robust set of generation options available to you. Yes, sir.
I understand there's no new nuclear in the limited case. Why is the existing decreasing?
Hey, you're running them out to 60 years. The assumption we made is you're still going to run the plants to 60 years. By the way, we're doing work on, we want to run those things to 80. I'm not sure there's an end game in nuclear. You just keep improving and keep running them and keep replacing and keep working them. So, but that was the assumption in the limited portfolio. Yes, sir.
Where did the full portfolio come from? Is that the optimized case in your model, or did
right.
it come exogenous in the model?
No, that's the optimized. The full portfolio is the optimized state, given access to all the technologies that we've outlined, based on certain time frames, like CCS becomes commercially available in 2020. So, yes, sir.
Are there any carbon price assumption you use? Could you change the merit order of merit between gas and coal?
Okay. The question was, what were the assumptions we made on the price of gas, and the price of carbon? Okay. We did make some assumptions on both of those. And let me get into the cost part, and I'll talk about those as well, okay? And you'll see that. Yes, sir.
It's an excellent analysis. And I'd like to hear more about what would give rise to these limits. Because one of the things that people, you've characterized it as this technology
So the question for those in the back of the room is, how do we arrive at the different limits and what are the constraints and so on? Limits were placed by, we know what the CO2 emissions are of the different technologies. We know what the estimated costs are. We know what the requirements are in terms of the constraints and the CO2, and so you optimize the model, and that comes a set of generation sources that will maximize economic wealth. Now, that's easier said than done. 50% renewables, there's some additional technical issues you have to deal with when you're looking at a world of 50% renewables. And certainly we can debate that one as well. Yes, sir.
What level of CO2 are you assuming at 2050?
What level of CO2 are we assuming in 2050? Okay. In the earlier chart, we had the emissions profile for the economy-wide. And it says that we will get down to about 1 billion tons of CO2 emissions in 2050 versus 6 million now. So that's the emissions in 2050. Does that answer your question? Or are you wanting to know what is the total emissions in the atmosphere at 2050? And do you know that's a good,
It's rough.
Yeah.
There's no way to know that unless you know what every other country is doing.
That's right. I want to, but what the assumption, right. And this is Revis James, and he was involved in helping with the model as well. So do you know, Revis? What?
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. We don't know what's going on internationally, so a precise answer would require a global model. But roughly speaking, the emissions profile here is roughly comparable to 550 parts per million airborne concentration, approximately, with the other international constraints that we assumed in our model. We assumed that the Annex B countries in the Kyoto Protocols adopted emissions constraints comparable to what we assumed here, and we assumed that the remainder of the world did not for this time period. Now, clearly, out to 2100, there's no way we'd be able to maintain that atmospheric concentration unless you made assumptions about the additional developing economies adopting additional emissions constraints. So if you wanted to answer the question for the ultimate atmospheric concentration, you'd have to have a more extensive international model. That is something we are working on, but we have not completed yet.
Okay, thanks. Let's take a look at what the world looks like in 2050, the generation mix. And you can see, using what I just showed, what it looks like. Certainly, renewables is over 50%. You've got gas. And with the full portfolio, a much more robust set of generation technologies that are available, including, as I said, CCS and nuclear. So what about the costs? What does it look like? If we look at the 2007 wholesale price, electricity price, is in megawatts per hour, dollars. You can see this red line. And as we look out over between now, as we run the model between now and 2050, you can see the difference in the wholesale price of electricity. This is the full portfolio versus the limited portfolio. This is an 80% increase in the real rate wholesale price of electricity in terms of 2007 of 80%, and 210% in 2050 in the limited portfolio.
Is there an inflation-adjusted assumption?
Yes. So now let's go back to that chart I showed you a while ago. Remember I said this red dot represents where we are right now. This is the emissions intensity profile versus the wholesale price of electricity in 2007. And I said that this is where we would like to be 2050, certainly a lower emissions intensity that meets the profile that I talked about earlier, 83% reduction in CO2 emissions in the economy in the U.S. When we run our model and we look at the costs associated with those generation options and the constraints that I mentioned, you find the full portfolio, you can see the increase there. We certainly meet the emission intensity goal that we established, but at a higher price, just like I mentioned, 80% increase. And the limited profile, look at the limited profile right there. So again, this is cost of electricity wholesale versus decarbonization. We want to move in this direction, and you can see the 210% increase in electricity by that time. Yes, sir.
Can we convert the full portfolio into more familiar versus retail prices?
The retail price, the question is, can we convert this into retail prices? And we can, and that's something a couple of people have asked about that. We've given this presentation several times, and we're going to go back and convert those numbers and look at what the retail price looks like. I actually have another slide that breaks it down and a little clearer on that, but we just didn't include it. But we're going to do that. It would certainly be north of that, right? Yeah.
Well, the change would be south of that.
The change would what?
The percentage changes would be substantially less than 80%.
Yeah, that's right. One of the insights, when we look at this limited portfolio, we say, well, why the increase? What is causing the increase? And as we looked at it and kind of analyzed it, one of the things is that by the time you get to 2030, 2040, you start seeing, remember I talked about the decrease in gas in 2040 to meet the emissions profile, and you're going to have an increase in renewables of 50%. That's part of what's driving this, because you don't have a robust set of options. You've limited your options. You're going to meet your constraint in CO2s, and so you get squeezed on both sides, and that's going to drive up your costs. And that's what you're seeing here in terms of this increased cost after 2030. So what are we doing to address these challenges? Meet the decarbonization in the energy sector, but do it affordably. What are we doing? What's the industry doing? And that's what I'd like to explore next. Well, first of all, certainly it's extremely important we have to move forward with the research, the development, the demonstration, and deployment, commercial deployment of a variety of technologies that I mentioned in a full portfolio. We have to do that. That's critical. That will get us to the full portfolio. But what do we do? Are we going to be satisfied with that? Are we going to say, we'll take the full portfolio and that's it? Well, to get us down to something that's comparable to where we are today, we're going to have to innovate. We're going to have to develop new ways of capturing carbon. We're going to have to develop new ways of utilizing electricity more efficiently. It's a tremendous amount of innovation that we're going to have to do between now and certainly the next 10, 20 years to make sure that we can further drive down the cost of electricity. That's our objective. Should be all of our objectives. Making sure we have a robust set of generation tools, generation options available to meet the CO2 requirements as we've outlined. So in conclusion, as I said, that's where we'd like to go. And early in the presentation, I said to get there, the decisions that we make today, and the choices that we pick, will dictate where we are in 2050. And that's why it's extremely important to understand what the options are, understand the technology, understand the bookmarks, understand the pluses and minuses of all of these so we can make wise choices in where we go. So with that, I thank you for being here, and open it up to questions. Thank you. I think, do we have a mic? Do we have a mic so we can hear some of the questions a little better? Okay, I think we do. Here. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. 2007 wholesale prices. Are you also using in your modeling 2007 market conditions for the cost of new technologies?
Yes, we absolutely. And the cost of the technology, we've incorporated that. We've incorporated our knowledge of not only the cost of the various generation technologies, but also some assumptions about the costs of even some of the subsets that make up the technologies and the learning curve that we will gain over a period of some time. And we've made some assumptions about that between now and 2050 as well. It extrapolated the costs based on scarcity of resources and others. So that's all part of what went into this economic model. Yes, sir, in the back.
Is there a public background document public a background document which gives more of the assumptions, such as the assumed cost of carbon capture, the assumed cost of gas, and so on.
Yes. In fact, we are working on that right now. In fact, Revis James, sitting here on the front row, and others at EPRI, are working on that document. And I'm going to put him on the spot. End of the month? Okay. End of the month. Go to our website, download it, take a look at it. We're talking about September.
We'll talk about this month.
This month. Okay. I just wanted to.
Say what year, though.
So I didn't know what year, right. So you can download that. You can also go and download the documents from the last 2 years as well. So if you want to look at it in more detail of what we've done the last 2 years. So, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to make just two comments to clarifying, because I think there might be other questions on these 2 points. One is on the technology costs. The question was just asked. There's a separate research program at EPRI called the Technical Assessment Guide, which has been around for well over 20 years, and there's an annual technology database that we go through a process of surveying utility companies, suppliers, internationally and domestically, in order to compile what we think are representative costs. Needless to say, that's a difficult process. Not everyone's willing to share information, but that is the way in which we establish what we think these costs will be. And having done it for 20 years, we've developed a sense of trends as well in terms of where costs are going. And, of course, over the years, we've developed some additional information on the commodities and the raw materials that go into the production of components and subsystems that go into power plants. So that's the first comment. The second comment is with respect to fuels. In that we do not make assumptions about the price of gas or the price of uranium or the price of coal. We make assumptions about how much energy is available in those resources that's recoverable, and we use external estimates of those resources. Like for uranium, we use the IPCC's estimate of global uranium energy. For coal or gas, we use the Colorado School of Mines potential gas committee's estimates. And then what we do is we have a module in the model that calculates supply and demand and calculates the cost of fuels dynamically as the model goes through its optimization calculation. And then the result of that is a changing price of fuel over time. Okay.
And one thing on the he mentioned the cost of the various technologies. That is publicly available, so you can go and also download that from our website as well. So you can, it's a couple of hundred pages, and you can go in. It's actually, I think, it's a pretty good document. Spent a lot of time putting that together. So wow, okay, a lot of questions. Let's go in the back. I think you've had your hand up for a while in the very back.
GE Energy. I guess two separate things, and you get to choose which one you want to answer.
Oh, okay.
First, I just want to understand the implications of the demand reduction piece. If that merge doesn't have bottoms-up technologies, so there's no energy efficiency supply, or something else going on. The model not converge because those technologies are available. That's one. And your other choice is there something in the module that limits the supply of, say, nuclear, for example, or CCS, based on material? You said, Revis, you said that it's had, you now track commodities. I'm wondering if that goes into the cost of technology.
Yeah. You want to take?
Sure.
Yeah.
They're just details.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, on the second question, what we have limits for the technologies that are exogenously determined, and they're based on considerations of things like build rates. So essentially, I mean, it's obviously very complicated to relate details on commodity markets worldwide to exactly how many nuclear power plants we can build in the United States. So we basically convened domain experts and decided how fast we think we can introduce different types of technologies, and then we placed growth constraints on the technologies. Now, on top of that, obviously, beyond those technical considerations, there are fundamental economic limitations to how fast technologies can double themselves in time. So those types of constraints are available from historical evaluation of many developed economies, and most of these models, like MERGE, have those kind of constraints already built in. So that's the first comment. Now go back to your first question about the efficiency one. Basically, that's a hole in our analysis that we're filling. we don't have technology detail on the demand side right now. We have a single adjustable dial on energy intensity and how fast it improves. And we've adjusted that based on consultation with our domain experts on efficiency and so on. But we are enhancing our model, and next year we plan to have a model that will have regional technology detail in each of the 3 major consumption sectors. So then what we will do is be doing new analysis that will add a lot more layers of sophistication in terms of adjusting different assumptions about efficiency. So that's next year.
The model right now has about 20,000 constraints, so it's it's not an Excel spreadsheet. Gosh, the white shirt in the back, everybody.
I was wondering, is there any representation of transmission constraints in the model, and how do you account for the cost?
Okay. So the question, just repeat the question. What are some of the assumptions we made around the transmission? And we all know if we're going to expand renewables, we've got to expand transmission. And what we did was, there's several studies, including some that we've done, that looks at the amount of transmission that's needed per megawatt of additional renewables. And we've incorporated that into a kind of a mega study and made the synthesis from that. It was input into the merge constraints. So yes, it does have additional transmission as well and costs associated with that to meet the renewable projections that's outlined in the merge models. Okay? Yeah.
Your model focuses a lot on technological feasibility and
Yeah.
economics. I was wondering if you've thought much about the political feasibility of these things. In the prisms that you showed going from 2020 to 2050, you have gas plants that are going online and then being less than fully utilized in the 2050. Is that something that PUCs are likely to go along with? How do you see that working out?
That's an excellent question. So we thought about all the political issues associated with this. The PRISM looks at technology bottoms up. Merge looks at what are the economic issues associated with deploying different technologies given some constraints. What we do at EPRI is to provide that to policymakers, decision makers, so that they can have a clear understanding of what are the technical issues, what are the economic issues around different scenarios. And then, we're unbiased, objective about the technologies. As I said, we love them all. We want to see them all deployed. And to then allow policymakers to kind of get a sense of what are the bookends. Then they can derive from that, what are the different political issues? What are the different political constraints by doing one or the other, so that they're more informed about what should be the direct course in these different directions. So we don't really make a statement about the political implications of these, but we provide that information to policyholders and others where they can help make a more informed decision. Okay? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Goldberg. Related question. In your case, when you do the expanded portfolio or the limited portfolio, what kind of government policy is assumed? Do we continue with the production tax credit? Will there be expanded loan guarantees for nuclear? What exactly are you assuming in the base case?
Another very good question. The answer is we do not make any assumptions about taxes, loan guarantees. That we don't. We assume that's just not part of the equation. And again, the reason we don't is that so you have kind of the extremes. What are the two worlds? Then you can kind of start. And once you understand that, then you can kind of start framing. Well, what if we do this? What if we do that? What if we have a price collar? What if we have some other constraints? And you can kind of start framing it in your mind. And so we did not make any assumptions, include that in the constraints, strictly based on the CO2 emissions profile. Okay, how about the lady in the there, purple, yeah.
Cindy Burbank with Parsons Mental Health. I wondered what your assumptions were about electrification of the transportation transportation sector, how it affects total demand, and whether in your greenhouse gas constraints you take credit for the shift from petroleum-based transportation to electrical.
Okay. In the economic model, we're modeling the entire economic-wide emissions. So the reductions that we include by incorporating electric transportation does affect the overall emissions profile. Because what you're doing with electric transportation is you're offsetting fossil fuel, internal combustion, with less emitting generation sources that will propel the electric vehicle. And it's that delta that you capture toward the improvement or reduction in CO2.
So how significant electrification do you assume?
It's a 1 or 2%. Yeah, it's a fairly small amount. It's, in fact, in another study we did, when you look at it 2030, you're looking at maybe a 1%, 2% max additional electricity generation requirement to meet the projections of electric transportation, even in 2030. So, okay.
Yeah, Bill Stevens with EPA. In the full portfolio, Mike, the amount of CCS that comes into play whenever it does possibly includes up to 60 gigawatts of retrofit?
Yes.
Can you say either how much of what comes in the full portfolio is retrofit, or if retrofit's being used at all, if it is economic?
Yeah, it is. We do assume, and we're doing a study right now to look at what are the technical issues associated with retrofits, and under what circumstance, what type of plant, coal plant, is a candidate for retrofitting. Obviously, it's the newer plants. It's got the space. That's at least probably 500 megawatts or so. So we're trying to capture that knowledge. And we have a study right now. We made some assumptions here. And one of the assumptions is that about 60% of the existing plants, 60 gigawatts of the existing plants will be candidates for retrofitting. And about 20, because we're 330 gigawatts. So 60% is 60 gigawatt, roughly 20% of the existing plants will be retrofittable. Yeah. Okay, let's go over here.
I'm Jan Merritt with RFF.
Okay.
Technology is absolutely vital for everything that you put on there.
Right.
To what extent have you, in fine grain, identified where the innovations are that you need to have happen, and then shared it also with the Department of Energy, so that the two of you could focus, or at least think about how to deploy public resources where it's appropriate?
Yeah. We have spent a tremendous amount of time with the national labs, with DOE. In fact, I'm at Oak Ridge National Labs on Thursday and Friday. We've been to NETL, been to NREL. We were at DOE on Monday. So we have a very good relationship with DOE and the national labs, and we're constantly having these discussions. What are the innovations that need to move forward? We know exactly what they are in terms of going from the limited to the full portfolio. CCS, as an example, is one of the critical requirements. Going beyond that, there are things that I could talk about. For example, solar. Solar that's significantly more efficient than what we have now. That's more cost effective, that you can easily deploy. Those are some of the examples that really require a lot of innovation. And we're having those discussions and have with national labs and DOE to make sure that the research that we're doing in the industry is consistent and certainly compatible and adds to what's going on in other areas, not only the national labs and DOE, but also universities, and we work with a lot of the universities as well. So we all want to move in the same direction, and it's extremely important. Why we also have these types of forums, so we can get the word out of what we're doing and what DOE and others, so we can all work collaboratively. I'm sorry? Yeah, okay.
Since so many politicians say we can't move ahead with any of this unless China also moves ahead on CO2 reduction, of your 40 countries that EPRI is working with, I realize China is not one, or probably none of them at the moment are really is you have a relationship of some kind with China on improving CO2 reduction, and what specific areas do you work with China?
Yeah. So the question is, what are we doing in China, right? I've been to China several times. We've had several discussions with China, also university level as well. We had some folks over there last year and this year. So we're trying actually at EPRI, we're trying to better. That's one of the things we're doing is trying to understand and get some clarity around our strategy and working with China utilities. And we have worked with some. I've worked on projects in Shanghai and Beijing and Tianjin and others. We also work with one of the nuclear plants there around non-destructive evaluation technologies. So we're working with, and we're trying to work through even an expanded dialogue and discussion in China. And but that's to be determined exactly the details around what we're going to do. But it is very important. They have, as we all know, a lot of coal, and unless and they're developing a lot of technology. I mean, they are actively involved in some CCS projects, ultra supercritical, more efficient fossil plants, and nuclear as well. So they've got a lot of work that they're doing, and we need to understand that and work together as well. So good question. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Hiko Nishimura from Tokyo Electric Power. And I saw your chart there that say very short time high increase of the electricity price around the year 2030.
Yeah.
And I think you explained the environment you assume around the time. And do you think are there any specific technology which pushes the price of electricity high? Like a higher price of natural gas or CCS, something?
Yeah. So the question is on the limited portfolio, the slide that I shows decarbonization on the horizontal axis and cost on the vertical axis. Between 2030 and 2040, you see this almost a wall. What drives that more than anything is the recognition that about that time you can't get it all with gas, and you need to expand renewables. I mean, that's part. So it's really a change in the mix of generation, while at the same time ratcheting down on the continued ratchet down of the CO2 emissions in the electric sector. So that's kind of both of those things come together to converge to have an increase in the wholesale cost of electricity. Given in the limited portfolio, because you only have limited options. In the full portfolio, you have other options that you can bring into the mix, and that keeps the price suppressed. Yes, sir.
I'm Joel Darmstead from RFF. I wonder if you could elaborate just a bit on your observation that there are no specific policy changes or policy options that are considered in the models. Except the fact that to a greater or lesser extent, the existing electricity situation and energy situation is affected by, and going to be normal, you could say, sorted by a whole array of government policies, production tax credits, investment tax credit, low interest loans to REAs, Price-Anderson, you name it. Now, to the extent that the future scenarios take as a point of departure the existing pattern or the existing structure of policies, at the very least, they're implicit in the model of the future, some degree of government policy. Now, a purist could argue, what would the situation today look like without all these distorting or implicit or explicit government policy? So it seems to me that maybe a little bit more articulation is necessary to get a sense of to strip away this existing array of policies, which may undermine the kinds of future that you're prepared to sort of to try to model.
Yeah. There's no doubt that the policy issues affect technology. It affects the deployment of the technology, affects the mix of technologies. There's no doubt about that. But in this model, we really look at more of a puritist, like you said, perspective of looking into technologies, looking at the costs, looking at the constraints, and we tried to, what would it look like without those policy implications? Now, others can take what we've done and derive their own conclusions about the different policy implications, but we have not incorporated that knowledge into this model.
Well, just to follow up for a second, we take wind,
Yeah.
which to a greater extent is shaped by the production tax credit
Right,
or
sure.
the investment tax
Oh, yeah.
credit.
Oh, yeah.
Same thing for solar.
Yeah.
Do you ask yourself what would the world today look like without those things, and how do we then move with respect to solar or to wind in the future?
Yeah.
In other words, are your projections with the model output wind and solar in the year 2030 or 2050, does it implicitly continue to embody the subsidies that it now?
No.
So which means you may have sort of an inflection or
That's right. It assumes no production tax credit, no rebates, none of that. No. Okay.
Simon Fried, representing myself. I have one question on your limited version. You show gas going down and biomass going up. But when you look at it chemically, the gas generates less carbon, CO2, per unit than biomass. So why does biomass go up under your constraints in 2050?
Yeah. You know, is that? Go ahead and grab that. Yeah.
That's current biomass technology based on agricultural residues and non-agricultural residues. What the model's doing is going to energy crops, and it's postulating some improvement in biomass technology, which reduces intensity. But that's only part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that the model's optimizing emissions and optimizing costs at the same time. So gas prices, by the time you get out to 2040 and 50, in that limited portfolio, because of the massive quantities of gas that are being used in that portfolio, the price of gas at that point is quite expensive. So in order to optimize the cost of energy, the model is looking for a balance between a mix of non-emitting technologies and emitting technologies that will achieve the emissions constraint and reduce the cost as much as possible. So a combination where gas is declining, biomass is increasing to provide energy, you have more wind. Remember, there was that big solar slice coming in there, which is a non-emitting technology, combined produces a better least cost option than a situation where you say you maintain the gas level and, for example, didn't have that biomass growth and maybe didn't have the solar come in. So it's basically a result of the optimization between the cost and the emissions.
You're saying the economics, not the chemistry.
Correct. That's basically it. It's the economics of providing a constraint because we're asking the model to optimize on cost as well as meet the constraint. So you have two constraints operating.
Good. Listen, it's unfortunate that we can't take all the questions. I really appreciate all of you being here. And this has been, every time we give one of these presentations, we glean additional insight, and I hope you have too. So certainly appreciate it. We'll be here a little longer, but we need to go ahead and wrap up. And Phil, I certainly really appreciate you hosting this, and RFF, thank you very much.